Good day, my name is Jahmira. I'm a student here at King University, and my undergraduate research project is Misconceptions of Mental Illnesses and the Use of Psychological Jargon. So to introduce my topic and how misconceptions and the misuse of psychological jargon, I will start off by explaining stigma and how stigma relates to these two topics. So what is stigma? According to Jahmira, stigma is the process that sets off by recognizing and labeling the difference between a person and other people. Stigma not only affects ethical groups, but it also affects racial minorities, gay and lesbian individuals, those with physical disabilities, and those individuals that suffer from chronic diseases. Bullet point 2. The process of stigmatization, according to Jahmira, like I said, begins with the process of labeling the difference between one person and other group of people. Then, this process goes on by dissociating this person from the rest of society. These individuals that have been stigmatized are usually discriminated against and have negative social consequences. Stigmatization in relation to mental illnesses, according to Stout. People that suffer from mental illnesses are usually the most stigmatized group and conditions in society, according to Stout. Individuals with mental illnesses usually receive negative attitudes, such as behaviors, attributions, misinformation, and in particular the association between them and violent behaviors. This can usually lead to people with mental illnesses being viewed as less than human. Continuing background information, because these individuals are viewed as less than human, this is a process of dehumanization. So dehumanization of individuals with mental disorders. So according to Kelly, dehumanization is defined as a categorical denial of membership of the most basic of subordinate identities. Human signals otherness in profound ways that can have dire consequences. So these people are viewed as less than human by detaching them attaching them from the identity as being human. These individuals usually become targets of aggression and neglect. Bullet point 2, the portrayal of individuals with mental illnesses in the media. Because these individuals are viewed as less than human, the portrayal of them in the media is also very inaccurate. So, according to Stout, mass media, television, broadcast, and news are many Americans' primary source of information for mental illnesses. These forms of media usually promote inaccurate portrayals of individuals with mental illnesses. These portrayals usually link people with mental illnesses to violent behaviors to a degree greater than which they are in the real world. And according to Stout, in that same study, he talked about how media plays a vital role in promoting social norms and solidifying a specific lifestyle. So because these people are viewed as less than human and they are stigmatized and ostracized based on these portrayals, they promote these specific ways that these people with mental illnesses are portrayed, and a lot of Americans, this is the only form of contact between people with mental illnesses, so they are now exposed to this negative portrayal. The effects of misleading portrayals in mental illnesses. So according to Stout, persons with mental illnesses are depicted as inadequate, unlikable, dangerous, and lacking social identity. And this is all based on some of the various forms of media and how they are portrayed on these screens. This usually causes ostracization, stigmatization, and stereotyping. This usually leads to misconceptions. These misconceptions are usually beliefs that are contrary to the popular or known evidence. Increased awareness. According to Basterfield, the overall misconceptions usually endorsed by people about psychological disorders range from about 28% to 71% across a variety of studies. This usually talks about whether the lack of mental health literacy, and mental health literacy can be defined as help-seeking behaviors, the ability to recognize specific disorders, acknowledge the risk factors, self-treatments, and promoting appropriate help-seeking. and being able to obtain mental health information. So my research question and hypothesis is that when individuals have misconceptions of mental disorders, they are more likely to misuse mental health terms and phrases. Participants. So the data was collected from college students around the United States, mainly students from King University. Participants were about college age and at least 18 years of age. These participants were found through email, through a link that was sent out through email. They were given the opportunity to receive extra credit if they did attend King University and had specific classes where the professor agreed to this extra credit. Other participants, again, were found through social media based on the link that was posted. The participants that attended King University all participants had no obligation to complete the survey and could have opted out at any given moment. My participant characteristics. So the survey received about 84 responses. 54 of those were female, 27 of those were male, and the ages ranged from about 18 to 23. Of those reported origins, there were 58 participants that reported to be white or Caucasian, 10 participants that reported to be Black or African American, and 8 participants that reported to be Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx. Of those reported academic levels, there were 31 freshmen, 14 sophomores, 14 juniors, 6 seniors, and those who reported to be in college. My methods. So the first scale that I used was Abnormal Psychology Misconceptions Questionnaire, and this scale was used to assess the broad spectrum of inaccurate beliefs regarding mental illnesses and treatments that would be used. This scale had about 40 questions, or true and false questions. Examples of questions were: most participants with severe mental disorders have a history of violence. And this also goes back to why I think this is important, because questions like these. My next scale was the frequency of misuse of psychological disorders. So for this scale, I use a Likert type scale Anker frequency, which range from never, rarely, occasionally, a moderate amount, and a great deal. This scale had about 20 commonly used phrases about psychological terms and jargons. Examples of these were: I'm so OCD, I'm so depressed, and I'm so bipolar. Finally, at the very end of my survey, participants were asked a demographic question. In these demographic questions, these participants identified their age, their sex, their academic levels, their GPA, their religion, and they also identified their exposure to mental health information, whether they have taken an abnormal psychology course, whether they work in a mental health setting, whether they have been exposed to various, and their exposure rate to psychology. Procedures. So first, participants signed an informed consent, and the informed consent basically told them what the study was about and gave their consent to participating in the study and the consent to the data that has been collected, and also providing them information to receive help if this study has caused them any harm. So after signing the informed consent and also identifying whether they were 18, the participants went on to the Abnormal Psychology Misconception Questionnaire, where they had the 40 true or false questions. And then they went on to the frequency of misuse of psychological terms, where they had the 12 commonly used psychological phrases and terms. Then they answered demographic questions, and then it went to a thank you page. And for those students that attended King University, there was an additional link to an extra credit page that was stored separately from the data. So the analysis that we use, I use two different forms of analysis. I use the independent t-test. The independent t-test was used to compare the frequency of misuse of psychological terms to the different groups, and then used to compare the perceived misconceptions of psychology among the different groups. And the different groups that I am talking about are whether their exposure rate to various psychological terms. The second test that I used was a correlational test that was performed to identify whether there was a correlation between misconceptions of psychology and the frequency of use in psychological terms. So here you can see the data that I collected from the frequency of misuse of psychological terms. And as you can see here, there was a relatively low misuse of psychological terms. For the scale had about 5, ranged from 0 to 5, and these results show that most of these people did not misuse psychological terms as much, as they mainly range below 2. So they ranged about into the never or rarely and occasionally categories. Basically, you can see in this information here, I found that this was pretty interesting as both psychological minors and majors, that in the psychological majors that you can see that the people that said yes to having that being in a psychology major had lower rates of misusing things than those compared to people that are psychology majors. While in this, those who are psychology minors had very little difference in between the two groups, as they only had 0.2% off, 0.2 off in terms of their range of how they misuse psychological terms. Also on this scale, you can see that there was no significant difference. So the results of my misconception of psychological terms show that there is no significant difference in the frequency of use of psychological terms in the following: work experience, the use of mental health services, whether the person had been diagnosed with psychological disorder or they've known someone else that had been diagnosed with a psychological disorder, whether they have taken an abnormal psychology or pathology class, whether they're a psych major, or whether they were a psychology minor. Here are my results from an abnormal psychology study, and here you can see that there again has been little to no significant difference, except for here where you see where people had been diagnosed with psychological disorders. And this may be that people that said yes that they had been diagnosed with psychological disorders had fewer misconceptions, as this may be because of their vested interest, and were more likely to have more knowledge and be educated about various things that affect us. Again, there's no significant difference between the misconceptions of abnormal psychology in the following conditions: work experience, the use of mental health services, taking an abnormal psychology or pathology class, whether they were majoring or minoring in psychology, and there was a significant difference in those who have been diagnosed, know someone that had been diagnosed, or a close friend has been diagnosed with a mental health condition. So there is no significant difference in misconceptions and the frequency of misuse of psychological terms, as P was greater than 0.01. There was relatively low frequency of use, as most people range in about between 0 and 2, as those were never, rarely, or occasionally. There was a significant difference between misconceptions between students who had been diagnosed with psychological disorders, as P was less than 0.05, and students who had been diagnosed with psychological disorder had significantly higher scores and fewer misconceptions than students who have not been diagnosed with psychological disorders. So the relevance of this study, I found that there was not many significant differences. The limitations is that the groups were not equal, and on average, there were about 10 people that had been exposed to the psychological conditions, as compared to one group that had 52 that had been exposed to had work experience. The limitations is to do this on a larger scale. The future directions is to do this on a larger scale and to have different participants outside of the